Hello, this is the second video I've filmed today, so you may be getting a little bit bored of me, but I'm hoping that you will find this video very useful if you're going to stitch Lucy Navier, the 2019 Queen of the May from Hands Across the Sea Samplers, and this is Lucy. If you are going to stitch Lucy, there is a stitch along that has been set up on Facebook, so it will be worthwhile you joining because people will be sharing their tips and their progress, and it's good to share. We all learn from each other. Now, the model of the sampler was stitched by Bethany. I haven't stitched the sampler, but because I have reproduced the sampler, it's given me a very good insight into the sampler, and I wanted to talk about how I would tackle this project, although if I was stitching it, I might find as I'm progressing through I might change my view. So please don't feel that you have to do this sampler in the way I'm going to propose. Nothing is ever cast in stone with needlework. You should look at each project with open eyes and go with the flow of the project. Now, the first thing I would do when I'd be starting any project, the piece of linen you have, particularly if it is an over-dyed linen, you should check the count of the linen, that it is what it says on the label. And you should check not only the width, but the length, the stitch count both ways. And the easiest way of doing this is opening up the piece of linen and going to roughly about the centre of the linen, and with a piece of thread, based out a line, 2 threads under, 2 threads over, and just stitch that out for a little bit more than an inch, and then stitch it the other way so you're forming like an L shape, and then take a ruler, mark out, or put a pin between the 0 and the 1 inch and count how many stitches are on the vertical and the horizontal. It's well worth checking the count of your linen first. One of the model stitchers for Hands Across the Sea Samplers, she said to me, this doesn't look right, it looks out of proportion. And when we actually checked, what was meant to be even linen was actually uneven linen. So that's just a little tip. And then the other tip I can give you before you start a project, please make certain that your linen has been cut square. And the easiest way of doing that is going to the edge of the fabric, and well, I can't show you on this fabric because it's being bound, but I have actually got a video that shows how to do that by removing threads from the edge of your linen. So look up that video, and that is something that is well worth doing. You do not want to run out of linen when you've started a project, especially a project the size of Lucy. Before I start any project, I always look at the stitches that are required, and I like to play with those stitches on a doodle cloth, make sure that I know how the stitches would be sitting on the linen I'm using with the silks I'm using. Different counts of fabric and different types of thread, can affect the appearance of a stitch. So once I've done all of that and I'm ready to start, I normally start a project in the top right hand corner, and probably how I would stitch this with my initial thoughts, I would stitch the vine, not the flowers, just the vine out all the way around. Then when I know that I have met up, I know that no matter where I move around this project, I have fixed reference points all the way around. But before I stitch this vine, I would take a moment to go to the graph pages, and then I would count that out right on there, how many stitches it is. I would make sure that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Are there 5 all the way around, or does it change? So I would just quickly count that through, marking out the numbers in pencil on my chart or on a photocopy of the chart. I have no problems with stitchers who buy our booklets photocopying the graph pages for a working copy. Obviously a photocopy should not be shared with other people, but it is good to have working copies. So I would go all the way around so that I know each section, that if there are differences, I am stitching what should be there, not what I'm presuming is there because it was that was the count on the previous undulation of the vine. And I do know on the stitch along, somebody who has already started realised that this vine is not the same all the way around. Now, if you really don't like stitching the entire vine out to start with, I would suggest with this sampler that you start at the bottom. For me, it would be more logical, if I was only going to stitch out part of the vine, to have the reference points at the bottom, because I think that this bottom section is the anchor of this piece. This sampler grows up. You know, the whole scene takes you upwards. Now, all of this is very intense at the bottom, and to sit down and to stitch this bank in one go without any sort of relief could get to be quite boring. And also, if you make a mistake, it's a lot of frogging to do. So how I would stitch this, and I really wish I had the model here to show you in greater detail, I would stitch out the bottom line, and I would stitch up here, and then all the different colours that are in this piece, I would stitch the outline. So I would stitch along here, maybe up here, put this outline in, then I would outline the different areas of the bank, okay. I would outline maybe these shrubs, and then I would have something that's very similar to colouring in books, where you have the outline and you just have to colour in, and that means that I could dip in and out of this area. Like I might say, right, for the first half an hour of each stitching session, I'm going to stitch some grass, and then that way I can reward myself afterwards with something a little bit more interesting. So that's maybe just how I would do it. And the other thing that I would do, I would personally find it easier to stitch the overwun motifs before I fill in the rest of the area behind. And again, I would maybe do one overwun motif 1 week, and you know, that's my penance for the week with the overwun motif, and then reward myself with more interesting areas for the rest of the week. When I come to do the tree, now the tree, if I can find it, right, okay, so this is the base of the tree, and the trunk we did in stem stitch. I would stem stitch the outline of the tree, and then I would fill in the tree. And again, with the branches of the tree and the limbs and all the foliage, I would take some simple cotton thread, and I would baste out all the outlines. Okay, I would just baste all the outlines out, and again you will have a section that's very much like the children's colouring books. The outline is already there, and then you can just colour in with your French knots. I think psychologically that would work much better for me than spending weeks doing French knots, although I personally find French knots very therapeutic. The other thing is, on this graph you will see that some of the sections have more than one colour symbol, and that means that you need to mix up. So this section has it has two different colours in. Other sections may only have one, and that's, you just need to vary them up to play with the tones. Now, there has been a discussion on Facebook about chenille thread for this. Two things you have to be really, really careful of. If you find a company that will dye chenille thread for you, one, you do not want that chenille thread to be bulky. If you have bulky chenille on this sampler, it will look all wrong. This sampler was stitched very, very finely. And the other thing is, if you're having the chenille dyed, you want to make certain that the dye lots really blend in with the rest of the sampler. This tree is so prominent, but it's stitched in the colours that appear in the rest of the sampler. If these colours are wrong, that tree is going to stand out like a sore thumb. So I think it would be wonderful if you can get the chenille, but just be careful of those two things. Now, with the swags and tails, again, these are all outlined, and let's find a good picture. Unfortunately, this came towards the end of the page. This is all stem stitch. I would stem stitch out the outline, and then I would fill it in. With stem stitch, I like to, if I'm going to stem stitch an area, I like to stem stitch that motif in one sitting, because the look of your stem stitch can really change with the mood that you are in. If you're a little bit tight, a bit wound up, your stem stitching will be tight. And I always, when I satin stitch or stem stitch or detach buttonhole stitch, I always do maybe a minute or two practice in the margin, a bit like if you were going to play a piece at the piano, you would do some warm-up scales. Just sort of settle into your stitching before you start the stitching on the actual sampler. So try to do your stem stitches in a particular area in one sitting. I don't think there's anything else that I can tell you about how I would stitch this out, but I hope that the few little tips I've given you, you will find useful. If you need help, I'm always here for you, and Bethany, who stitched the model, has volunteered to help people as well. We want you to be able to stitch our samplers, and we will try our very, very best to help you. Don't forget about the videos for the stem stitch, the satin stitch, the Algerian eyelets. All of those videos form the Sarah Mary Larkworthy workshop. And I did post a little video about French knots. French knots are nothing to be afraid of. It's just understanding how you do them and finding your rhythm and your tension. And it's like everything in life. You can't pick up your needle and expect to stitch a different stitch straight away. Everybody has to practice. So enjoy, Lucy. You're going to have a fabulous, stunning sampler to hang on your sampler wall with her. Okay, bye-bye.